Mr. Boyer, you have an en bloc amendment. Without objection, the en bloc amendments, if you'll identify, I think you already identified them?
No, I have not.
Okay, would you identify the amendments you wish to offer en bloc?
Chairman, I reserve a
Chairman,
point of order.
the en bloc request will be 8 amendments.
8 amendments.
It will be, mine is identified as CCA 09-097. It's Boyer 100% CDC allocation. Number 2 is the Burgess 032 regarding international offsets. Then there are the next 5 amendments are from Mr. Upton, identified as MPB2 564. Next is MPB2 565. Next is MPB2 566. Next is MPB2 567. Next is MPB2 568. And the last amendment would be Scalise 001A regarding a 5-year reauthorization of Title III. Mr. Chairman.
The members have heard the identification of the amendments, and the amendments are being distributed, and the gentleman is recognized to speak on his amendments. And he has 5 minutes. He can yield time to others, but it's his 5 minutes on behalf of the en bloc amendment.
I'll first identify Mr. Burgess's amendment regarding international offsets. He seeks to strike the International Offset Authority. Mr. Burgess is seeking that the allowances go to the source of emissions. Regarding the Boyer amendment, I have great concerns about the proposal before us would award individual utility emissions permits based on a percentage of their emissions in retail sales. I believe this results in a windfall revenue for those regions in the United States with 0 or low emissions and is a disproportionate burden to those who are dependent on fossil fuel. Indiana in particular, fossil fuel dependency is 99.6%. So I did a little math. So when I go back and I do the math, the data compiled by EIA sales data and extrapolation of the NERC sub-region data and EPA emissions data. What I have learned is that for a typical Indiana utility, NIPSCO or PSI, they would get, under the present scheme in the bill, 0.55 to 0.57 allowances per ton of emissions. Now, a typical California utility, I'll choose Southern Cal Edison or PG&E, they would get 1.34 to 1.63 allowances per ton of emissions. In other words, they're going to have more than they need to sell back to the Midwest and other parts of the country. For a typical Washington utility, for example, Puget Sound or Seattle City Light, Puget Sound would receive 0.96 allowances per ton of emissions that they are responsible for, and Seattle gets 4.86 allowances per ton that they're responsible for. So, Southern Cal Edison gets 2.43 times the allowances per ton of CO2 emissions than a utility in Indiana, and PG&E gets 2.97 times more than one in Indiana. Seattle City Light gets 8.84 times the allowances per ton of CO2 emissions in Indiana, and Puget Sound gets 1.7 times the amount of munitions. So this allocation formula, I think, would be better if it's based on the carbon content of fuel. That is a much better mechanism to lower the costs to consumers. With that, I would like to yield 1 minute to Mr. Scalise of Louisiana to discuss his amendment.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Indiana. This amendment just places a 5-year sunset on the bill, just like so many other things we do here in Congress. Earlier today, FAA just got reauthorized. Highway bill has to get reauthorized. If you look at this bill, and of course, if all the predictions on the other side are correct and all the jobs would be created that they say and no job loss would occur, there'd be a line from here to Maryland to reauthorize the bill. But if, on the other hand, a lot of the things that we've suggested and so many outside experts have suggested, and even your own bill suggests that there could be massive unemployment, jobs going to China and India, as well as more carbon being emitted because they would be done in countries that don't have our regulations, then we should have a stopgap measure in place to give a protection that this has to be reauthorized. The word unemployment is in this bill at least 16 times. There's over 50 pages dedicated to unemployment. Then they get into words like partial separation, adversely affected employment 46 times. That's the same thing as unemployment. We've talked about off-ramps, there's a title they even start using political correctness and say, bridge to retirement instead of unemployment. So there's all kind of terms in here, over 50 pages dealing with unemployment. If that happens, this should at least be and have some kind of accountability in place so that the taxpayers, the people that would be unemployed because of this bill, should be able to have some relief.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. I now yield the remaining time to Mr. Upton.
I want to thank the gentleman for carrying this amendment. My amendments really do protect the consumers. We know the Michigan story. Things are bad, expected to get worse. And if things in the rest of the, if the economic climate in the rest of the country follows Michigan's poor lead, we are in real trouble. And what my series of amendment does is this. And by the way, we heard today from Mr. Radonovich that I guess electric utility increases in the state of California are going up 11%, and that's before this bill gets enacted. But if this bill gets enacted and things continue to get worse for the rest of the country, we provide an off-ramp. We say that the bill is, these provisions will be sunset if utility account terminations reach 8 million households. The second bill, we say that it's sunset if gas arrearages hit an average of $400. It's the average. We say that it will be sunset as well if the average arrearage in an electric bill equals $175. And the fourth bill, if natural gas arrearages accounts equal at least 1 in 4 households around the country. And the last one, we sunset it if percentage of overdue accounts in the electric industry hits 25%. In parts of Michigan, we're 1 in 3. Probably $400 to $500 million in lost money going to my utilities in Michigan because of high accounts. If this legislation increases the personal consumers' accounts in gas and electricity by a magnitude of what we've already seen in Michigan, we say stop. Consumers, you're going to be protected, and we're going to come back and help you by sunsetting this legislation and come back and go through a markup to make this bill a little bit more responsible, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Markey is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. There are 8 separate component parts to this en bloc amendment, so I will try to, in this brief period of time, reflect upon a few of them. First, the 5-year sunset, essentially, on the bill. In terms of creating a marketplace for predictable investment in the technologies that are going to be necessary in order to move us to this clean energy jobs future, it will basically discourage a very large percentage of what we believe to be a $1 trillion marketplace ready to go once they know what that marketplace is going to look like. And so just from the very beginning, saying that the whole program sunsets in 5 years ensures that the investment will not be there. Second, in terms of the allocation with regard to the utility sector, we work with the Edison Electric Institute in developing this formula. This is a formula that was accepted across the full span of the Edison Electric Institute. It's something that was embraced by them and actually serves as a foundation to the legislation. Perhaps it could have been tweaked here or there, but you could not, in fact, achieve a consensus in an organization that broad unless those internal deliberations led to a certain regional fairness in terms of the way in which that program was constructed. Thirdly, in terms of international offsets, as we all know, 20% of all greenhouse gases are emitted because of deforestation. The preservation of the rainforests of our planet are without question one of the most cost-effective way in which compliance with this bill can be achieved. To remove international offsets from this legislation would be to, one, make it more expensive for all of the entities covered by the legislation to comply, and secondly, we would not be investing in that area where we could have derived the greatest reductions in greenhouse gases. So the totality of the amendments that are all bundled here in this one proposal reflect, again, a skepticism of the legislation, and that is the right of the minority. But at the same time, we believe that in its totality, that the provisions which we have dealing with consumer rates, working through the Edison Electric Institute, looking at the trade-exposed, energy-intensive industries, looking through the steel industry, the cement industry, the paper, the aluminum, and other trade-exposed industries in terms of the allocation formulas, looking at the natural gas, the oil heating sector, putting together these formulas, all intended to create a pathway that makes it possible for industries to make the transition with consumers to this new clean job creation future that backs out the imported oil while at the same time reducing greenhouse gases. So I hope that the members on our side reject these amendments.
Would the gentleman yield
to the chairman, if he would like, for a comment. But beyond that, I just urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Mr. Barton seeks
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
The reservation for point of order is withdrawn. Mr. Barton?
2 minutes.
Yield to you 2 minutes, and you may yield
some
to others.
to Mr. Boyer, but let me say first, on the international offset program, that is a disaster waiting to happen because the UN and the European Union have been trying to find a way to get compliance with their international offsets, and they have admitted that it is almost impossible to do. Again, we're not opposed to an offset program if you're going to have a cap and trade program with allowances, but those offsets ought to be domestic, not international. And there is some, again, implicit acknowledgement of the problems internationally because it requires either 1.25 or 1.5 tons of international offsets to get a 1-ton credit in the United States. On the 100% allocation that Mr. Boyer put in play, that is a huge issue and is something we're going to discuss hopefully at length in the hearing that the chairman has promised to have. You really do create a regional disparity. If you're in a region where all of your electricity is generated by coal or natural gas, you get a 50% allowance. So you're going to have to buy 50%. If, on the other hand, you're in a region where the electricity is generated primarily by hydro or wind power or nuclear power, you get your 50% for your emissions, and then you get 50% for your retail sales, if I understand it. That is an absolute windfall. And what that means in the real world is money is going to go from the South and the Midwest to the Northwest and to those areas that have a heavy component of nuclear power. It's an unfair windfall. Now, the fact that EEI supports it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. And I would guarantee you that if this bill becomes law, we will come back every year and tweak that, trying to rebalance that balance. I want to yield negative 13 seconds to Mr. Boyer.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask you unanimous consent for 30 seconds?
The gentleman will be given 1 minute, and he doesn't have to take it all.
I thank the chairman. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to agree with you. I believe every member here in this committee, we want what's best for our country. And as I look at the map of the country, I recognize, as Mr. Shimkus had brought out, that there are regions of the country that have a higher standard of living, and they are going to have their utility bills drop under the present schematic in the bill. And so the numbers that I shared with the committee, I think, tell the story very well on how I believe that the 50-50 formula is unfair. But that's the dimension which I see the world because I come from a state that's 96% dependent. But, Mr. Chairman, I want to compliment you. I want to compliment you on the arc of fair dealing and wise tolerance in which you have handled the gavel through a very difficult mark, and I extend my personal compliments to you for having done that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. The vote now, despite those kind words, I'm not going to vote for your amendment. The vote now comes on the Boyer amendment en bloc. And as much as I like Mr. Boyer, I should make, I'm chairman. The vote now comes on Mr. Boyer's amendment en bloc. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. No.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call.
Okay, let's go for a roll call.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Mr. Harmon, Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner. Where are you? Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Barrow. I'm sorry, Mr. Melanson. Where is he? Vote. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Is Mr. Inslee? Where? Oh. Mr. Inslee. No. Mr. Inslee votes no. Okay.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Chair sees no other members seeking recognition. The clerk. Okay. Clerk will announce the vote.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, on that amendment, there were 20 ayes and, I'm sorry, there were 20 ayes and 38 noes.
20 ayes and 38 noes, and the amendment's not agreed to.